Well, when I was young, I was concerned probably more about my suffering than anything else. Not that I was particularly suffering as a young person, but I was concerned about things like the afterlife, what happens to a person when he or she dies. And in large part because of my concerns about the afterlife and suffering eternal torment, I became a born-again Christian when I was in high school. And by doing that, I thought that I had ensured that, in fact, I would have a happily ever after. And so to that extent, suffering affected me, although always from the time I was young, I was concerned about suffering in the world and wondered a little bit about how one could explain that.
How did suffering finally lead you away from religion?
Well, after my born-again experience, I became very committed as a evangelical Christian. I suppose for a number of years I was a fundamentalist. Went off to a fundamentalist Bible college and then to an evangelical college to complete my college education. I ended up going to a theological seminary, Princeton Theological Seminary, and was trained as a minister there. Over time, my theological views started changing away from the evangelical camp toward a more kind of liberal form of Christianity. But as I thought more about the world and tried to puzzle out how this world could be in the state that it is, I was increasingly concerned about the problem of suffering and how one can explain that there's suffering in the world if the world is supposedly controlled by a loving and powerful God. And it was the old problem that people have wrestled with for centuries. If God's all-powerful, he can obviously prevent suffering, and if he's loving, then he wants to prevent suffering, and yet they're suffering. Eventually, this problem, which goes by the technical name theodicy, this problem of theodicy eventually got to me, and I came to realize I really couldn't answer this problem, even though I knew what the standard answers were. I knew what people said about it, but these answers were no longer satisfactory to me, and I eventually decided that I could no longer believe in an all-powerful and loving God.
What are the standard answers that became unsatisfactory for you?
Well, the main answer that people give today when I tell them that I'm working on this book or working on this problem, the main answer people tend to give me is that the reason they're suffering in the world is because of free will, that God wanted people to be able to worship him, but to worship him they have to be loving of on their own without being forced to, so that we're not programmed as robots. We're free human beings, but since we're free to do good and to love God, we're also free to do evil. And so it is possible to hurt another human being because we have free will, and that can explain things like the Holocaust, or Idi Amin, or Pol Pot in Cambodia, or just one person acting badly toward another. And for a long time, I thought that was basically a satisfactory answer, that the reason they're suffering is because of free will.
Why do you no longer find that satisfactory?
Well, I think it's absolutely true that people can do harm to other people. There's no doubt about that, and that horrible disasters like the Holocaust can be explained on that basis. But free will can't explain a lot of other things. It doesn't explain, for example, why every 5 seconds in our world a child dies of starvation. Nobody's choosing to make this child die of starvation. This happens every 5 seconds. Or it can't explain a tsunami that hits Southeast Asia and kills 300,000 people. So natural disasters simply can't be explained on the basis of free will, and so there need to be some other kinds of explanations.
I think another kind of typical answer you hear to the question, how can there be suffering in a world where God exists, is, well, we can't understand his ways. I mean, suffering exists, and we may be incapable of understanding why, but he has a reason.
Yes, that is a common answer, and I think for a long time that was the answer that I held on to. The problem with it is that if you say that it's all a mystery and we can't understand it, then in effect we're saying that there is no answer, and so one is left hanging. I mean, if God is in control of this world and he loves people in it, then why he would allow people to starve to death or to die of malaria or to die in a tsunami, it is absolutely beyond our ability to understand. But then why should we think in the first place that there is a God who's all-powerful and in control of this world, who's loving? Because, in fact, it looks like all the evidence points to the contrary.
If you're just joining us, my guest is Bart Ehrman, and he's a distinguished professor of religious studies at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And his new book is called God's Problem: How the Bible Fails to Answer Our Most Important Question, Why We Suffer. In your book, you examine various ways the Bible answers the question, why do we suffer? So let's start with what you describe as the classical view of suffering. What is that view?
Yes, well, the view that's found out through most of the Bible, especially through most of the Hebrew Bible, the Christian Old Testament, is the view that the reason people suffer is because God is punishing them for their sins. The assumption behind this is that God is powerful. He's in control of this world and everything in it, and he's loving. He wants his people. He wants the best things for his people. But the problem is his people have gone against his will, and so he creates suffering for them in order to make them wake up and repent and turn back to do his will. This is an answer for suffering that you find throughout all of the prophets of the Hebrew Bible, for example, Isaiah and Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Amos, and so forth. They all said this page after page after page, that the reason the people of Israel were suffering is because they had done things wrong and God was punishing them as a result. And this is a view that people still have today. So when something bad happens to someone and they say something like, "What did I do to deserve this?" Then they're buying into this idea that they've done something that justifies their suffering. And so this is the classical understanding of why they're suffering in the world.
And another example from the Old Testament you give for this is in Proverbs. The Lord's curses on the house of the wicked, but he blesses the abode of the righteous. So what's your problem with this point of view, that we're blessed for the things we do that are good and punished for the things that we do that are wrong or sinful?
Well, I think the problem that I have with it is the problem that some of the other biblical authors had with it, which is that when you look around the world, it just doesn't seem to be true. The people who are righteous aren't the ones who are doing particularly well as a rule, and those who are unrighteous aren't necessarily suffering as a result. And so the problem of why is it that the wicked prosper and the righteous suffer can't really be solved by this particular point of view, that suffering comes as a result of disobedience.
Okay, another biblical view of suffering is that suffering is redemptive. Give us a biblical example of that.
Well, we get it both in the Hebrew Bible and in the New Testament. In the Hebrew Bible, there's this terrific story in the book of Genesis of Joseph, who is one of the 12 sons of Jacob, who incurs his brother's jealousy, and they end up they're quite jealous indeed. They sell him to slavery, and he becomes a slave in Egypt. And God is working behind the scenes, so that the reason Joseph, as it turns out, has gone into slavery in Egypt is because God is going to use him in order to save the chosen people. At the end of the book of Genesis, Joseph has risen in power and become the right-hand man of Pharaoh, and as his right-hand man, he's able to solve problems that the country is facing, especially the problem of a worldwide famine. And his brothers, not knowing who he is, come to him for help, for relief of famine in their land, and he's able to save them from their suffering. And they're nervous about it because they realize they sold him into slavery so many years earlier, but he tells them not to worry about it because they meant it as an evil deed to him, but God meant it for good. And so God has redemptive purposes working behind the scenes in order to bring about the salvation of his people, in this case, the deliverance from a worldwide famine. This point of view is especially dominant, though, in the New Testament. The entire point of the Gospels and of the Apostle Paul is that somebody had to suffer for the sake of others, that these authors portray Jesus' crucifixion not as a miscarriage of justice or as a very bad thing that happened to Jesus because other people were exercising their free will. They portray it as a redemptive act, that by suffering, Jesus was able to pay the penalty for other people's sin and thereby bring about salvation. And so throughout the New Testament, we get this very strong message that suffering can be redemptive.
So what's your problem with this?
Well, I think it's absolutely true that in many cases there are instances when our own suffering brings about something good for us. I mean, there's often a silver lining behind the clouds, so to say. But a lot of times, I don't think suffering is